Yasmin Kadu here, your Dearborn Girl poster child that is a lifelong learner and loves all things social justice. Today, we have the pleasure of talking to Maali Luqman, a global citizen, alchemist, and humanitarian. Hi, Maali.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. So, we know you love traveling and we love Dearborn. So, if Dearborn was a destination, what would it be?
It would be one that's rich in good food, lively culture, and a lot of spirit. Would remind me of Madrid, Spain.
Ooh, I like that. I like that. Awesome. So your descriptors are super interesting. Can you tell me a little bit about why you chose the words global citizen, alchemist, and humanitarian?
Yes. So I identify as a global citizen because I've done a lot of traveling throughout my life, domestically and abroad. I grew up having two homes as a child. My father lived in Florida, my mother lived in Michigan, and so 3 times a year, my siblings and I would fly out to see him. And then in between those years as well, we would travel overseas to Yemen, Egypt, Dubai to visit family.
Interesting, interesting. Awesome. So can you tell me a little bit about the alchemist?
The alchemist. So I'm the type of person that I like to take every single moment and every single opportunity and turn it into something greater. So
Give me an example of that because I can think of one right from my internet stalking of you, but I'd like you to share it with everybody.
Okay, so I chose to turn my master's level thesis into a book. I also chose to take my summer study abroad and turn it into a documentary. So I like to take every possible opportunity and every blessing that's sent my way and turn it into something greater.
Amazing, amazing. Can you tell us a little bit about your book and the topic of your book?
My book is called Trumpeting Hate. It's about the impact of political rhetorics on minorities and the American image. And so it assesses the impact of Donald Trump's rhetoric on the different minority groups in the U.S. I focused on 5 groups: African Americans, Muslims, Jews, Hispanics, and then women. And so through an assessment of the rise of hate crimes, I was able to come to a conclusion that rhetoric does impact minorities.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. So before we jump into all of that, because we definitely want to hear more about your book and more about your travels and your studies, let's talk a little bit about your Dearborn Girl story and kind of what paved the way for you to become a humanitarian, alchemist, and a global citizen.
Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, I grew up in 2 different homes. I spent most of my life with my mom. We lived in the South End of Dearborn, and 3 times a year, my siblings and I would fly out to Florida. My mom was a hardworking immigrant Muslim woman in hijab. She raised 4 kids on her own at a time that we didn't have Skype and she didn't have family or anyone around. So she's a complete trooper and she's my inspiration. And then when we'd go out to visit my dad, my father was the chief of medicine in the hospital that he worked at down in Florida. So growing up, I was able to see what it feels like to grow up, to struggle and work really hard for everything you have, but I was also exposed to a more privileged lifestyle. So I'm able to kind of identify both. So seeing my dad's lifestyle allowed me to see what opportunities await outside of the South End of Dearborn, and so that exposed me to thinking outside of the box.
Definitely. Tell me a little bit about growing up in the South End.
Growing up in the South End, it was a fun and rich experience, but it also had its struggles. The South End, as many people might know, suffers from environmental injustice. It's right outside the Ford factory, so there's a lot of pollution that's pumped out daily. There's also a lot of noise pollution because there are train tracks that run right behind a lot of the neighborhoods, including mine. There's also an industrial road where a lot of semi-trucks drive through and things of that sort. So it's just very neglected part of Dearborn. But it's also a very close-knit community. So unless you grew up there, you don't realize how rich that is. So neighbors become like family. It's a very culturally rich community. So it was definitely a privilege growing up there, but also a lot of struggle when it comes to pollution and just being neglected by the rest of the city.
Yeah, definitely. I think that the South End story sometimes is silenced because of the fact that a lot of the narrative in the community tends to be very grounded in the East and West End try to take up this space a lot, and the South End, we don't see it on a daily basis if you're not constantly going there. So tell me about growing up. What was it like on a daily basis, and did it provide any inspiration for the work that you've done right now and you continue to do?
Yeah, absolutely. So my mom was very, very active. She had actually worked at Salina Elementary and Intermediate School for about 25 years before she retired. And so while she was working there, she was a community leader because a lot of people would go to her with different issues. She was bilingual. She spoke Arabic and English and was able to be a liaison between the community and the school. And so I learned a lot from her about being active and being a voice for people that may not have the tools that you may have, whether that's language or just knowing how to advocate for yourself. And so a lot of times she would include my siblings and I in different efforts to bring more environmental justice to the South End. So we would be engaged in town halls and things of that sort when it would address the pollution in the community and how to try to minimize that or reduce that. So that definitely fed into what I do now because I am very active. It's very hard for me to kind of sit back and be complacent when it comes to anything that involves injustice.
It's very interesting you say that because I feel like we talked about this before too, about being an activist is inherent. And so it sounds like from your journey too, where it was something that was taught from a young age and then you just continued to work on, and you can't ever lose that too either, because I think for me personally, like I would definitely call myself an activist, but it's not something that I feel like I'm able to turn off sometimes, and I think it's kind of hard, especially when there's so many issues you care about.
Right. I think it's not just what we care about, it's also our identity. So I remember when I was studying for my master's and we were doing a student-led trek through Palestine, and I was the only muhajaba in the group. And so my classmates were really concerned about my well-being because I was always kind of targeted at checkpoints and things like that. And I remember one of my classmates who was Asian asked me, "Why did you even consider coming if you knew that you would be targeted this much?" And she did it out of a place of concern. She was really worried about me. And I explained to her, I'm like, this is kind of natural for me, where I grew up where my identity is constantly the target of whether it's Islamophobia or whatever it may be. And so it kind of just became a part of me to be an advocate and to be outspoken. And so I think we carry that everywhere we go when we're being bicultural, where you have no choice but to be political. You have no choice but to be an advocate because who you are is always going to be scrutinized, right? So
Definitely. Where did you do your master's at?
I did my master's at Harvard, alhamdulillah.
So you know that, so ignorance is not exempt from Harvard then. So
No,
for
no,
her
no.
to ask that question was just completely and totally like not educated too.
Yeah, I think it was more of just concern where she was actually questioning like, where did you get the courage to do this,
okay.
right? Because I still handled it well in the sense of I feel like many of us who are young Arab and Muslim American women, we develop so much resilience that it shocks others, where they almost question like, where do you get this resilience from? Like I would have ran home the next day, right? And to us it's kind of like, this is just a part of who I am because I go through this on a daily basis just based on the way I dress or based on my ethnic identity or my faith. And so I think people are just more shocked by that level of resilience.
So what do you respond to people when they ask you, where do you get your resilience from?
I educate them. Personally, my resilience, I get a lot of it from my faith. I think of times that I hit rock bottom, and the one thing that gave me the motivation to keep going was my faith and knowing that there's always going to be a better day. There's always a purpose and a reason behind every struggle I'm going through, and to try to just kind of collect the gems from that struggle and prepare for moving forward.
Definitely, definitely. That's beautiful. So we talked a little bit about identities and like the global Arab American narrative. Let's talk about that a little bit more and what your perspective is on that.
So I think one thing that a lot of us who are bicultural don't recognize as a strength is the fact that we are bicultural and we are bilingual. And part of being bilingual means that you not only understand two languages and two sets of vocabulary, but you also understand two ways of life, two ways of thought, two ways of connecting with people. So studies show that children who are developing two languages, they might take a little bit longer to develop the vocabulary because they're learning the same concepts in two different vocabularies, two different ways of understanding. But then once they start developing it, their ability to learn exceeds those of monolinguals, right? So the wisdom behind that is when you evolve, when you grow into an adult, you're better able to connect with diverse groups of people and understand the world from different perspectives, and it makes you a much more well-rounded individual.
It's interesting because I think that a large portion of Dearborn's community is constantly going back and forth between Dearborn and their homeland, and I think that it kind of adds to the statement that I'm become like a soapbox for, where I always say Dearborn doesn't see the value in itself. So if we have a group of people that are constantly being able to hone in on those attributes and we're not able to see that. So I guess my question for you is, how as a community do you think that we can hone in and really bring that strength forward?
I feel like many of us are ambassadors, and we may not realize that we're ambassadors to our cultures and our faith because of that, because we do connect with two different identities. Growing up, I know people would sometimes put you in the position where you had to choose between Arab or being American. If you go to the Middle East, they question your Arabness. If you're in the U.S. and you're outside of Dearborn, people question your Americanness, right? And I came to a realization that you don't have to choose. You are both, and you can be both. They are not mutually exclusive. And as a matter of fact, you can be an ambassador for both. So you can build that bridge between the Arab community and the American or the non-Arab community. And so I think that's a strength that we have that we need to tap into.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. So you were an educator in Dearborn. So tell me a little bit about your experience doing that.
So I learned so much from my students. Kids have a way of teaching and reminding adults of how to live. And so I gained a lot of my inspiration on becoming an alchemist through the students, right? Because you would see a child take something as simple as an assignment and turn it into gold, right? So they would be able to find so much excitement in it. And that kind of revived something in me as an adult at that time, to appreciate life and to kind of seize every moment that kind of died away with being an adult. But after a while, I kind of felt confined to the classroom, and I wanted to take all of my global experiences and my life experiences outside of the classroom and just kind of become an educator on a larger platform.
So I guess my question for you too is, I know that you taught in Abu Dhabi as well. So compare Dearborn students to students in Abu Dhabi. And maybe even
different.
Very different.
Yeah,
in
very
what ways?
different. I feel like our students are more comfortable with diversity. I think it's just because of the U.S. demographic. In Abu Dhabi, it was different. Diversity was more difficult for them because a lot of the students were locals or they were natives. So if there was a student who was not from the UAE, it wasn't as well tolerated. You had to educate them about diversity. Definitely the language was different. So at that time, they were implementing an English curriculum to Arabic speaking students, and they didn't have the tools we had. So it was different, but at the same time, our students are a lot more independent than the students out there.
So you, after you finished teaching, you decided to go back and get your master's at Harvard, and you studied international relations. So I guess tell me about your inspiration to do that.
That's a really good question. So I think one thing we don't tap into as much, and I kind of mentioned it earlier, was that we don't tap into the strength of being bicultural. And when I was in the classroom, I saw my impact with my students. And I had some great feedback from a lot of their parents, a lot of my students, a lot of their future teachers. And I realized that being a bicultural individual or a bicultural leader in the classroom was so impactful that should be taken outside of the classroom, considering what's going on. So our political climate was pulling me in one direction. And I felt like there was more of a need for our unique experience and expertise outside of the classroom. And so I chose to master in international relations because that's a field where we needed more diverse representation. And at the same time, my own personal and experiences just traveling abroad and understanding different people from different backgrounds was a strength that's not commonly found in that field.
So what did you find through your travels and even your master's program too? Were there a lot of people of Arab descent in
No, not in my classes.
And so did you have a specific, as far as international relations, was it specifically the Middle East, or was it just on a larger global scale?
It was on a global scale. There were a couple classes that I took that focused on the Middle East, but it was just on a global scale.
So at the time, what was the rhetoric like when talking about the Middle East, and did you ever have to act as sort of an ambassador for the Middle East?
I did, more so too as a Muslim woman in hijab, where I remember one of my classmates asking me, and it was at the time that Trump was running for office, so all of that rhetoric was really out there. I actually was flying back into Boston the day he was elected.
Wow.
So I was at the watch party at the Arab American National Museum the night before, and I had to go home at around 2 a.m. because I had to catch a flight at like 6 a.m. in the morning. And so I remember going to bed not knowing if he had won yet, but being in tears because he was in the lead.
Yeah.
And woke up going to the airport and just being really crushed, right? And I remember the airport was really dead and still, and everyone was just in low spirits here in Detroit and as well in Boston where I landed. And then I remember I took public transportation to get home in Boston, and there were a couple conversations that sparked up on the bus. And luckily, they weren't hostile conversations because Massachusetts did vote blue. But conversations did come up in the classroom as well. And I remember one of my classmates saying, "Why don't you just tie up your scarf in a way that doesn't make you look Muslim?" Because we were talking about how I shouldn't have to feel threatened to be on public transportation in my hijab. And I think he didn't realize that I would be as vocal as I was, because people tend to carry a lot of implicit bias and assume that we're more submissive than we are. And I told him I shouldn't have to. I shouldn't have to be something I'm not just to feel safe, that I shouldn't have to be the one to change, but that rhetoric and that stigma is the one that needs to change. And I felt like that resonated with him, and the rest of the class as well. As a matter of fact, my first thesis proposal was about hijabi women in America and their identity. That's kind of what I wanted to do my thesis about. But then that shifted because Trump's rhetoric was really impacting minorities, and so I wanted to focus on that instead.
So I haven't read your book, unfortunately, yet, but I'm definitely going to after this conversation. But can you tell me a little bit about how maybe your first thesis kind of related to your second? Because I feel like they would be hand in hand.
Yeah, absolutely. So in my book initially started as my thesis, and then I evolved it into a book. There's a segment that talks about the Muslim American community and how they're impacted by negative political rhetoric. And so it does talk about tragedies such as our three winners, Yusr, Dia, and Razan, and what had occurred with them. That was something I also researched when I was completing my research for Muslim women in hijab and a lot of the violence that they face. So if you're aware of that story, the reason those three young college students were murdered was because of the hijab that Yusr and Razan wore. That triggered a lot of hate in the man who murdered them. So that was something that I did cover in the book as well.
Wow, that's very, very powerful. So one of the reasons we started this space was because we always say that representation matters and words matter. And I think that from my understanding of your book, that's like a big thing that you cover. Can you tell me what that like representation matters means to you?
Representation as in what we're putting out there?
Representation as far as like people in the halls of power, like if you look at right now, like Ilhan Omar.
Right. Okay. So when Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar were elected, I think a lot of people were surprised. I wasn't. I was more like, that's just the beginning, right? Because I feel like when you're really in touch with women of color and you get into really deep intellectual conversations with them, we have the experience from our own lives as well as the intellect and the resilience to know how to tackle a lot of these major life and world issues, right? And so it's just a matter of us recognizing our strengths as strengths, no longer being silenced for being that strong, and also taking them to the next level where they could be a benefit to everyone else. So yeah, representation matters, but we definitely need more women of color leading.
Definitely, definitely. I mean, I think that our identities have began to stop being silenced, where I think that was something that people struggled with before. And even the comment that you received about your hijab, like, to tie it so people wouldn't know that you were a Muslim woman. Like, that is quite literally silencing your identity.
Right.
And I think that shift too right now in the media has just begun something that's going to be just take the country by storm. I love that you said that you weren't surprised that they won, because unfortunately I was one of those people that was surprised, even though I rooted for them like no other. When they won, I was just elated, but I was still a little bit surprised. So we talked about the Arab and Muslim narrative from a global perspective. I'm just very curious to hear about your hopes for the Arab Muslim narrative on more of a domestic level, but what you want to see it look like in the future.
Here in the U.S.?
Yes.
Definitely want to see more activism, and at the same time, I see that we're already kind of working towards being more polished in the sense of our delivery when it comes to critical issues. I know that we have, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of expertise and a unique insight that others don't have, because we do live both identities within ourselves, right? And so we can relate and understand both. But it's just a matter of knowing how to articulate that in a way that brings people together and isn't divisive. Not to say that we are, but just to polish it in a way that it really brings more unity. So I think I'd want to see more of that.
More unity. Yeah, definitely. Especially because I feel like we've become so divisive as far as like Lebanese, Yemeni, Iraqi, Palestinian, and I could go on and on. But I think that within the communities, this is something I say a lot, that we need to just be more unified and realize that we have more strength in numbers and we have more things in common than we even realize. So I guess my question is now, instead of talking about it on a more national, domestic level, let's hone it in on Dearborn. And what are your hopes for Dearborn as far as the Arab Muslim narrative goes? Because we've been saying this a lot with the space that we've created, that we really think that Dearborn should be at the forefront of the Arab American narrative, because we not only do we have the highest concentration outside of the Middle East, but nobody else should be telling our stories as far as what it means to be Arab in this country.
Absolutely. I know a lot of times when I travel throughout the U.S. and people know I'm from Dearborn, they always, ask interesting questions. And,
like what?
I've been asked things like, what happened with Dearborn? And when I question, and these are other Arab Americans, excuse me, other Arab Americans ask me what happened with Dearborn. And they say, you guys are the largest population outside of the Middle East. They're expecting more from us. And I can see why, right? We have a lot of potential that we haven't tapped into yet. The outsiders can see. And sometimes I wonder if we're a little too comfortable in our little bubble and become complacent. And that's something that I'd want to be a little more aware of.
That's a really interesting thing that people have like noticed that from the outside, because I think that you're absolutely right, and they're even right saying that the bubble is something that we sometimes get stuck in and grounded in. But I think it's not because of complacency. I think it's because we have such a strong sense of belonging and such a strong community. And I think that might be a double-edged sword that we probably need to be more aware of, as far as seeing the value in our community and seeing the value in the work that we can do on a more national scale. So we talked a lot about your hopes for the future and your hopes for what you want to see Dearborn become. If you could go back and talk to your younger self, what would you tell her?
So when I was a bit younger, and I was in my undergrad years, I remember that was a really rough time for me, as it is for a lot of people that are just getting into college. You go through a lot of an identity crisis, trying to figure out who you are, what you want out of life, where you're going. And it was a dark time for me. But the good thing about hitting rock bottom is there's nowhere else to go but up. And I remember one night being on the balcony really late with my sister, and I was just staring into the night sky. You couldn't even see the stars from all the pollution, but I knew they were still there. So I just wanted to tell all the younger people going through anything that no matter what cloud is hovering over you, there's always something beautiful beyond it if you just believe and if you work hard to achieve it.
That's really beautiful and poetic. I love that. So my last question for you, why are you proud to be a Dearborn girl?
I'm really proud to be a Dearborn girl because it's the one place where you can be extremely different inside and outside, and you can be a strong, vocal woman while still adhering to your values, regardless of how conservative they may be deemed to be, and still be respected and honored for it.
Amazing. I love that. Thank you so much.